During the 19th and 20th centuries, a small, isolated municipality in northern Sweden did a lot of starving. Rye was their primary crop, and when times were good, everyone ate rich rye bread and rye cakes and rich rye beer. However, rye is kind of touchy. Early frost can kill rye, so can late winters. Heavy rains can rot entire fields of unharvested rye. Not enough rain, on the other hand, it will dry out and kill it. All this meant that starvation had a generational ebb and flow in the municipality of Överkalix. One generation of Swedish children would starve, sometimes for several years. Then the next generation would live in abundance as rye bread rained from the heavens. Then another generation would starve for several more years. On and on this cycle would go, all while the church kept meticulous family records. These records include births, deaths, causes of death, and harvest yield, which may not seem like much, but in the hands of genetic scientists who could crunch the numbers, it's a treasure trove of data sets. This generational starvation data from Sweden also revealed some bizarre fail-safes built into our DNA, switches, which would turn off and on depending if it was a starving year or not. And these switches would spark incredible changes in the actual DNA of the generations to come. For example, boys who experienced famine at around the age of 9 produced grandchildren who were practically immune to cardiovascular disease. Conversely, a huge surplus of rich foods during that same period, when the village children were around 8 or 9, led to higher diabetes rates in their grandchildren. The famine periods also led to epigenetic adaptations and improved metabolic efficiency, which basically turned them and their grandkids into metabolic machines, capable of processing fats and lipids more effectively than the rest of us. But before we start starving 9-year-olds to breed generations of heart-healthy people, these famine periods came at a huge cost. Less food during development means stunted growth, both physically and mentally. It also meant more stress, more cortisol, and worse immune function, which means their DNA, which was supposed to be set in stone, had adapted itself not to benefit themselves, but to benefit their children. But what if we could find a way to have our genetic cake and eat it too? What if we could design a village where everyone starved, just a little at the right age, but where they also got the nutrition they needed, exactly when they needed it? Or if we designed a village where children received just the right amount of love and attention to make them kind-hearted. Yet, they were also forced to exercise and drill, like the army, to make them healthy and hardy. Would a perfect environment work? Or would we just confuse children and their DNA? Welcome to the field of epigenetics and the newest scientific practice of rewriting our DNA through optimized behavior, aka the Epigenetic Clock Project. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet.
Today's big question, Joe. Epigenetics. Can you change your own DNA?
So I used to watch a lot of science fiction. Like I used to watch the movie Gattaca and cartoons like Batman Beyond, where they would like alter their genetics and they'd be part animal. And then there's like Island of Dr. Moreau, where they could literally change their genetics and become part cat or whatever. And obviously there are so many movies about like extending your life and things like that.
What was your fascination with that?
I think it was there is a almost biblical search for perfection that people have. I share the same thing. It's what if we could fine tune ourselves? What if we could almost like a, a primordial need to purify the human. I don't mean that in a like a crazy genetic determination kind of thing. I mean that more as like, what if we could go in with tools and a microscope and fix ourselves?
I think we do,
Um,
like, surgeries for things that are physical, and then we try to learn things, and we try to become limitless superhumans, right?
right. Well, that's where like I kind of now understand why people who follow religion don't enjoy talking about evolution anymore, because evolution is so damn messy. Like we it's beyond just like what we have as like people who are like, well, if we're made perfect and in God image, why do we have vestigial organs that need to be removed or they explode? Like you have an organ here in your stomach that will blow up someday, and you have another organ over here that just kind of produces bile but nothing else really, and you have a pinky toe, and but then you look deeper and you look at like the actual genetic code, and it's like, what is it, 95% was considered junk DNA for a while, and then we started learning that like 95% of quote unquote junk DNA is actually DNA about like records from what diseases your genetic line has conquered, and code for like what to do if there's a disaster, and old genetic code from like the dinosaur era of like
You're running from
yeah.
saber-toothed tigers, your flight. So then you quit your job the second your boss yells at you because you.
Right. What if I get saber-toothed tiger rabies? What do I do then? Well, my genetics have a backup plan apparently. But yeah, I've now been watching like lectures by Robert Sapolsky, and watching these like lectures, and reading back up on methylation, because I haven't looked into this in like, God, it's been like 15 or 20 years. Um, and it's come such a long way. So our big question, and this started out with a extended conversation with some friends, and going back and forth about this. This was not a cleanly invented episode, but the question is very, very simple, and you asked it. It's what can we change? Um, and if I ask my uh, coach at the gym, like I had a personal trainer at some point, and they were like, everything, you can change everything if you're diligent and you put in the work at the time, and you eat right, and you quit drinking alcohol, and you don't smoke, and you avoid diabetes. He's like, you can literally change everything in your DNA. And that's not true. Like, we're not going to get to that point, but we are going to get to some pretty remarkable studies that show how much you can change. um, what drew you to this episode? Like, what were you trying to or hoping to change in yourself, and do you think it is changeable?
I hang around having my own addiction issues through the years, and not drinking and not doing drugs or being a health workout person. I feel like I've probably changed myself a lot more. Um, I'm not going to say than most, but at different parts of my life, I feel like I've almost, become a different person to the point where I almost don't recognize the other person. And a lot of it is just physical health.
Okay.
And I wonder if, there's always that thing of the time, right? If I would have been sheltered at a younger age, if I would have avoided certain things, how different my life could have been. I guess it's realizing my own ceiling, the rewards of what my life would look like if I had lived this kind of Puritan life.
What if you had lived in a blue zone? We had an episode last week about debunking blue zones. Or what if you had been nurtured properly? Like, what if you'd received a different amount of love? Um, so
Just a
I
couple
think,
of turns wrong, you know what I mean? And
right.
I see it in people. I see it in, I'm a huge Tom Brady fan, the NFL football player. And he really was an extremist on taking care of his when he wasn't on the field. And he made more money. He played longer than everyone else. It said that he spent $1,000 a day on his body and his mind on resting and recovery. So that's $300,000 a year. $365,000 a year.
Do you think, how much of that do you think is him changing his own DNA, or just having healthy habits, or how much of that is he's literally born to live longer? Like it is just baked into him. He's one of those like people who just doesn't age very fast at all, like Eddie Murphy.
I think it's a combination. I think just to think that way, you're built a little different. Your DNA is a little different. To be that disciplined and be that, I don't think discipline's the same, right? To have that set of values and to be that consistent.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Oh,
And I see you're getting at
yeah,
habits, right? Is it habits or is it at what point do you cross over and you're not that person? And then how do you measure it, right?
right. Who are the people who are born genetically healthy to where they can smoke 12 packs a day and eat whatever they want and they'll still reach 100, versus who is like Tom Brady where they're born with conscientiousness, they're born with a discipline, like literally it's written into them to be disciplined and stick to itive, and they have grit from basically birth. um
Well, do you believe that, Joe? Do you believe, and I guess we're basing it on success, we can measure success things. Do you believe that there's certain people you meet that, whether they're an attorney, Olympic swimmer, a writer, they're going to be successful in something,
yeah, they
and
came out baked like that. Yeah.
and then they're going to outdo their siblings. Period. You can see it when they're kids. I've had friends like that. You could just tell they're the most mature, they're the most grounded, the most goal driven. And so later in life, they do look like different human beings, even though they have the same DNA.
Right. There's the marshmallow test that they put on where like scientists would put marshmallows in front of kids, a marshmallow, and be like, okay, if you wait 15 minutes while we're out of the room, you get two marshmallows, and they'd leave the room, and like the kids who were able to wait and delay gratification, turns out they can delay that gratification and get the big reward later in life for everything. Like the ones that can do it at 2, they can do it at 18. They can delay partying to study and things like that. How
That's
much of that
DNA.
is, I
That's
was
DNA.
exactly going to ask that. If they can do it at 2, well, then it has to be DNA, right?
Yeah, because they're not that conscientious. It's just the way they're geared.
Right. There's a video of Natalie Portman, by the way, taking the marshmallow challenge at age 2, and it was hilarious. But and she graduated like Harvard or something. So I think if you're okay with it, our show usually follows a narrative, but we did so much narrative on the last episode where I kind of want to just go through this, explain what methylation is, what it does to our DNA. Like basically, methylation is the on-off switches in our DNA that we know now because of good science that we can turn it off and on. So like, let's just go through these one at a time. We're talking nurturing, trauma, stress responses, intelligence, conscientiousness, metabolic health, longevity. Let's just go one by one, and we'll talk about, in our own life, what evidence we've seen that people can change it or whether they can't. We'll speculate, and then we will actually have the answer. Like we'll look at the studies, and we'll talk about what has proven that we can actually change it through good habits and long practices. When I say habits, I mean like building healthy habits that can change these things, but they have to be done over a very long period of time. That's a big stressor. um, and if you're okay with it, first we'll get the boring stuff out of the way, which is very fascinating but very dense. What is methylation, and what does it do with our DNA?
I like to think our
Um,
show is boring all the way through, Joe, not just in
yeah.
parts.
Well, our show is officially labeled as a sleep aid. Um,
Don't mix with alcohol.
yeah. So, question the first is what is methylation? Methylation is effectively you have too much stress in your life, or you starve at a certain age, or you don't receive the right kind of nurturing when you're very young, and something will sort of like take the place of where a hormone can bind, or where an enzyme can bind. Something will trigger on off in your DNA, and it will kind of change you a little bit. And it does this to save you. Like the idea is these switches exist in our DNA to make life easier for us. Um, for example, our opening narrative is all about starvation ages. This was our some of our first really good studies about methylation. Is food is one of the most absolute basic ones. You starve too much, and your body will adjust. Your body will release hormones to make you hungrier. It will release hormones to make you need less food. Your calorie content will change. Like we had a whole episode about The Biggest Loser, and how everybody who participated in the show The Biggest Loser, they permanently changed how many calories they had to eat a day. They have to eat 800 calories less per day, and if they exceed that, they get the weight back. They regain the weight, which is insane. Like that's that is another half a day's worth of food. And they can't have it. Like they have to minimalize their diet from now until forever because they changed their DNA. Um,
Trying to get healthy. I think if you unpack that a little bit more, right?
right,
They
exactly.
went and got these personal trainers and got these dietitians, everything that would check off all the boxes of improving your life and improving your health. And it was done under medical supervision as well.
Right.
And it was just set up to fail. It was set up to can you imagine that emotional roller coaster for those people?
Yeah, I mean, imagine being at the end of the show and being like, I won everything. I won the money. I won my life back. I won my health." And then finding out that you have thrown switches in your DNA that will make it to where you never can eat food again. And also you're going to regain the weight, period. Like, it will happen. It just will. That would be so crushing. that is the definition of an emotional roller coaster. Um, so don't do extreme things and don't do fast things once you hear this episode. Everything you should do should be slow, deliberate, and planned out for the long term. And we'll explain why. We're going to get into some amazing studies about epigenetic clocks and a scientist who has figured out how to reverse aging by a couple of years. We introduced that in the last episode. We're really going to get into it this one. Um, but the what he called his name is Horvath, and we're going to link to his studies and his YouTube videos. His stuff has been replicated by multiple colleges across the world, so it's good science as far as we know. Like as good as we can sort of assume any science is. It was really thoroughly looked into and replicated. Um, and he called methylation rust on the DNA. And the older you are, the more rust you have on your DNA. And I thought that was the most
Rust.
elegant way I've heard it described. Like, of all the
Explain that
studies
to
I've
me.
listened to,
Explain the rust part.
well, if you start out your life and you're a baby, um, and you don't have any of these switches thrown yet, like nothing has bonded to parts of your DNA. You haven't undergone enough stress or starvation to really make this a problem. And let's just assume that you didn't throw any of these methylation, these methyl markers in utero, meaning your mother didn't drink too much and she didn't starve or anything like that.
You're just a sponge for life right now, right?
Right. You come out with a clean strand of DNA, basically, and the shoelace ends, the telomeres of the DNA, they haven't been shortened because you haven't had your cells haven't replicated too many times. So you're clean. Your DNA strand is just a string of good information. Um, then one day I come up to you and I burn your house down, or I make you starve for an entire month. Suddenly, you've got these switches being thrown in your DNA strand, and they're not bad. Like I said, they're meant to too much stress in your life. Your body's going to make it to where you can handle stress better, but you're going to have an anxiety response. You now have PTSD. You will react very fast if an explosion happens or if a bear comes at you. You'll know what to do. You'll run away. But from now on, your stress level will be slightly higher because these little switches have been thrown. You starve, and suddenly forever you don't need quite as many calories in your body to sustain you. So these little switches get thrown, and it's for a lot of things. We're gonna the initial study was about starvation, but we now have evidence for like 7 or 8 major things that will change your life depending on which switches get thrown. And every one of these little switches, just imagine it as a little speck of rust on your DNA. And they can now go through and look at how much methylation is present on your DNA, and there becomes so much of it that's what he said. Is he said it looked like rust.
I just can't help but think of 1968 or whatever, Vietnam draft. A kid from the Midwest who's really goes to church on Sunday and works on the farm on the weekends and goes to school, and all of a sudden he's seeing horrible things as an infantry person in Vietnam. just changing them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is
Rust.
exactly. Yeah, I was just about to say that. You go through all of these negative things all at once, and suddenly you've got you throw all your methylation markers to survive all at one go, and then you come back and you're a different person, literally a different person. Um, so let's start there if you're okay with it, because I want to talk trauma and nurturing and stress response. Let's start there, and the idea is, you know, how are we shaped by our stress response? In your experience, have you been able to change your stress responses and your traumas?
I have, but I don't know if it's from maturing. I would say I call it low testosterone. I used to get monkey mad at everything, but now I
Okay.
don't get as mad. But I don't know if that's biologically because I'm older and I don't have that fight in me anymore. Does that make
you
sense?
you might be too old to get that angry again.
Yeah, I might not be able to physically handle. Does that count?
I know why old philosophers look so calm all the time. It's because they literally can't get as angry
I
as they
can't get
used to.
that. I
Yeah.
can't get as mad. I used to get when I would get angry. How I would handle my problems is I would punch holes in the wall. This was this was how I handled my problems. And my ex-wife used to start charging me to have him re-drywalled over. And that changed
Right.
that behavior. But that was a behavior. So why don't you give me an example of you? Do
For
you
me, uh, um, I used to think that I hadn't gotten nurtured enough, and this was a theory that went around my family. So I'm not making this up. I'm not like serial killer territory here. It's just I was born at a time where both of my parents were very stressed out. They were frequently out of the house, and I did not have a good connection with my parents. Um, and I thought maybe that had affected me. It probably did, but not now that I understand this a bit more. Probably not as much as I was assuming. Um, I didn't let it affect my decision making. I never said, I never like slam the door in somebody's face and they're like, "Why would you be such a dick?" And I'd be like, "My mother didn't love me enough," and then I'd run away. No, it was one of those things where I just sort of had this suspicion in the back of my mind that lacking a nurturing figure meant that I
eternal
was
pain or eternal loneliness, maybe a little bit?
yeah, which I honestly think that's what's affected my need for attention as a writer. The reason I became a writer might be I need that validation, which is a very cliche thing to say. I know I'm saying this and people like rolling their eyes. They're like, "Yeah, of course," um, but I have learned through this study that like your amount of nurture that you get can actually affect your DNA. Like if you want to talk about what's the first possible switch that can be thrown like in your DNA, what's the first bit of rust? It's nurturing, and then it goes to stress and it goes to trauma. So we'll start with a quick nurturing study, if you don't mind me telling a short story about this.
Please.
Um, they had a study where mice they would take mice and they can't cut into a human head and look at their brain and be like, "You've been really nurtured, like your mother loved you," and then like put their brain back together. That's impossible. So they did this with mice. They would look at mother mice who were good mothers, naturally good mothers, and they would watch them groom their pups. Grooming means licking, like they'd lick them, clean them, lick their ears, like make sure they're doing the right thing. um, and they would find that when they opened up the brains of the mothers and the pups, that they had thrown a switch for nurture. That oxytocin and like love hormones and positive like hormones and developmental hormones had been present, and that the baby mice, if when they were allowed to grow up, they carried that to their children and their grandchildren. So like they imprinted this nurture early, and even if they skipped a generation, even if they made sure that the daughter of a nurturing mother, even if they did not themselves get nurtured, they would pass on grandchildren that were nurturing. So like when we talk about changes in the DNA, it can go multiple generations. Like it's not just it switches it for you, it switches it for your grandchildren, kind of like our starvation study that we opened the episode with. Um, so even if they never got licked, grandchildren of nurtured mice would be nurturing. And the scientists were like, "Wow, that's impressive. We just proved that a certain amount of nurture is actually nature. That you can be born a nurturer." As a human, that kind of sounds dumb. That's a no duh. It's We've all met people where like we meet the girl at the office who is literally everybody's mom. Like she takes care of everybody. She'll put a band-aid on your finger if you get a boo boo and you're an adult. But there are people who are just born nurturers. um, and they took this a step further. They decided, well, hell, if we have a mouse that's a bad nurturer and is anxious, like a bad mother, like I don't know what we call that, a dance mom mouse. They're
Just
and they take the bad mother and they well, you can't take a pup or a kid from a bad mother. You cannot assign it to a good mother mouse. You can't swap mice pups to other mice. They'll eat it. They'll be like, "You're not my pup," and then but you're protein, and they'll kill it and eat it. What they will do is scientists figured out that, well, we can't swap pups to see what happens if a anxious baby gets nurtured by a nurturer. We don't know if that changes them or not. Um, if we can't swap the pups, what if we do a swap with surgery? So this sounds ghoulish and horrifying, and I'm sorry to say this, but it was good science. They would open up two pregnant mice. One was a nurturer, one was a good mother. The other one was a terror mom who was anxious and had so far never nurtured their own pups. And they would swap the babies or the embryo in utero. So they'd open them up and make them a surrogate. And the nurturing mom mouse who had the child of an anxious mouse, what do you think their percentage chance is to be a nurturer?
I'd say 100%.
That's very generous. That'd be amazing. Like to nurture an anxious, a genetically anxious person, to nurture them back to normal.
I'm thinking of an
Um,
adopted kid, a foster kid that was young,
right.
was adopted as a baby.
See, you're doing the 2+2. That's exactly what they kind of came up with in the study. Is at the end of it, they're like, this kind of reflects well on whether or not we should nurture people who come from terrible mothers and people who have horrible trauma and horrible anxiety issues. It was better than 50-50, a little bit better. So like
Really?
a mouse that will come out shaking and anxious and terrified because it came from a anxious terrified mother, and it was in their DNA to be anxious and to not be nurturing. If they were born to a nurturing mouse mother who licked them and treated them well and was nice, apparently it was better than 50% that they would turn around and become normal, and that they would normal out and they would become a nurturer for their own pups.
Well,
Um,
I just had a friend who adopted, and she's not. He didn't just. He adopted her 18 years ago, and now she's off to college on a full scholarship, and he adopted her from Romania. And he said when him and his wife did it, they one of their biggest was concerns was because you don't know the history of the kid you're getting adopted, you don't know the DNA, and he said that alcoholism is so prevalent. Him and his wife were deathly afraid that no matter what their plan was to just to give her unconditional love and attention, but they knew that there was a chance that she was going to have serious substance abuse problems when she got older. And
right,
he's just so grateful now that that's not the case, but that's the 50-50, right?
right.
And I know we're talking about rats, but are we, because I've seen it both ways. I've seen it where the kids turn into probably what they would have been like, similar to their biological, you know,
Well,
bad
we are
bad
talking
choices.
rats. Yeah, but we're also just talking chemistry. So like, there's a certain amount of, yeah, this is going to carry over. Um, the, by the way, the question of is it nature, is it nurture? Are you born a certain way? Can you train? There's the Jesuits used to have a saying, which is, give me a child and I'll show you, like I'll make him into anything, or give me a child young enough, I'll turn them into anything. And then there's also like a famous psychologist, Watson, who said basically the same thing. He's like, give me a child of 8 and I'll show you the man he can become if you let me train him. And That's not true. There are some people who are born, let's say, slow-witted, or who are born without the temperament to be a doctor. Doesn't matter how much you train them, they're never going to perform surgery. And vice versa. There are people who are like, they're born sharp and fast mentally, but they're not good with their hands, and that's genetic. And then they're never going to be a car mechanic, no matter how many times you put a wrench in their hand. They're going to give you back
Yeah.
a broken muffler.
Just because they're 6'5" doesn't mean they're going to play basketball.
Right.
It's impossible.
So we know from studies like this, and repeated studies, that nature and nurture, it's about 50-50. You give a child who has bad genetics, who comes out of the womb with a bunch of these methylation markers thrown. They start out with a lot of rust on their DNA, and their mother had huge stress responses and was drinking, and they come out with these stress markers thrown. You've got about a 50% chance or better to reverse that, to by nurture and by good behavior and by being loving and giving them attention, that you can change that. And that's a great chance. Like that is so much better than we used to think. Like there used to be literal psychology books and literal like political studies written about how like you're born with it. It's all genetics. You can't change it. You know, you're cemented.
You're wasting your time.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I couldn't help but think about this when you were saying this, because I come from a generation of men who thought it was, and that is not the case nowadays. But there was a time when you were not telling your son that you love him or that he was anything was
Oh
seen
yeah,
as,
make them soft.
yeah, soft and weak. And it just, to me, it seemed, and I never understood it and I was far from perfect. I was rough around the edges, but not to tell my stepkids that I loved them and that they were good looking. And I don't know how they did that. To me, it seems so easy. I mean, I could not say it. I would have to go out of my way to not say it, you know?
Yeah. I feel the same way. I've often thought, is it because generations just get softer and softer as we go? Are we becoming more socialized?
It feels that way with the helicopter parents. I feel that way when I see all these parents at the bus stop. I cringe. I know
Right.
as a young man, I would have never let my mom walk me to the bus station. I would have been horrified. And I mean, at a young age.
Like a 8-year-old in a suit, like, mother, hand me my tin, my tin lunchbox. I must leave. And then you hike off.
Yeah. And my hooligan friends were waiting for me, parentless.
Yeah. Well, I've after reading these studies, specifically about how much of your DNA can be changed for trauma, nurturing, and stress response, I took a lot of this information with me when I started looking into like therapy and things like that. And for me, I naturally have anxiety and depression. I have a physical component to my anxiety. I have a disorder where I can get dizzy. It's called a vestibular disorder, and it always makes you anxious, period. Like there's no getting around it. There's no meds for it. It just makes you very anxious because it's a physical trigger. Um, but I also
Is it from events that's going on in your life, or is it just a physical, just once in a while
once in a while,
you
and
gotta take a time out kind of thing?
yeah, and high blood pressure makes it worse. So it was one of those things where I was born with it, but it started triggering because I had high blood pressure, and there's a lot of like cross morbidity or comorbidity to it. But the notion is that I've always had bouts of depression here and there. I've always had some anxiety. So reading through these studies and being like, okay, can if you've already thrown these switches for trauma, if you've come back from war, or if you have something that triggers your anxiety naturally, or if you have a high stress response, can you meditate your way out of that? Can you practice mindfulness? Can you stress manage your body so efficiently it eventually convinces you to live in a peaceful balance, and it convinces your DNA to go back to normal? Like, can you do that? Can you meditate your way to less rust on your DNA? Um, and the answer is really honestly quite shocking. I thought this was going to be some woo woo holistic bullshit, where I read through it and found out that no, obviously that's crap. You can't astral project yourself. You won't be able to go back in time mentally and heal your younger self. Like my father went to like crazy spiritual groups because he was like a '60s kid. and he believed you could do that. He believed you go back and talk to your young self as a ghost or some crap like that.
Well,
You can't. Yeah,
therapy, just modern day therapy, not even to go to any kind of hippie camp, but that's kind of
yeah.
how it's taught. You need to take care of those things that happened to you when you were a kid. That's kind of what that's implying.
Right, and even that is sort of modern psychology is kind of looking at that and saying maybe not. Maybe you don't need to go back and solve every little traumatic moment in your childhood. Really, all you need to do is convince your body now that you live in a peaceful, balanced environment that no longer requires you running from bears or being threatened by rival tribes, or that your stepfather is going to hit you, or whatever the trauma triggers were. You don't have to go back and like face them necessarily. Like some therapists don't
Yeah.
even do that anymore. They don't do regression therapy sometimes, or they don't do some therapists just refuse to make you live your past again. It would be more
Yeah.
triggering really than anything.
Because that's what it does. Sometimes it does more damage.
Right.
Sometimes you understand the trauma a little bit more too, and it gets uglier, right?
Right, exactly.
You
So
get
so
more resentful of your family. If that's at all possible, let's
well
stop doing therapy. I feel worse than I did before.
you walk out of therapy and then you want to slap your parents. You're like, what did you people do to me? Um, so no, it's apparently much more effective to spend several years in calmness. Just convince your body that you live in a balanced environment, and that is apparently enough over the course of a couple of years to lower your stress responses. So you can literally balance and calm your way out of a certain amount of these methylation markers that have been thrown. Um,
I've done this. I've done this.
that's I thought of you. That I don't want to be insulting, but when I read about this originally, I was like, Todd used to get super mad, and I've
Yeah.
known you like as long as I've known you, you've been meditating and you've been working on this,
It was
and so
yoga. It was doing
yeah,
yoga daily, and it took almost 2.5 years of doing meditation. That's how long it took. And then all of a sudden there was a peace and a steadiness that I didn't have. Early when I was doing meditation, I couldn't slow my brain down. And the only way I could do it is because through the physical part of the yoga, and then I would talk to the people next to me. I would be loud, I would be fidgety. And then it took about 2.5 years. And then there was literally a peace that it's hard to describe. But it is definitely relaxing and worth it, you know. And it was only worth it because it didn't come easy.
yeah.
It was literally like breaking through, like melting through an iceberg, and it took that long.
Well, I won't take away from you the idea that age did some of that, that just less hormones did some of that, less less of testosterone. But I think you're right. I really do. I really did read that study and think of you and how long you've been practicing meditation and calmness, and I'm like, Todd has probably actually literally changed his DNA for the better by doing this. Um, there's something else you mentioned to me once. We talked about you know uh, being born smart. Um, and you've talked to me about like how much studying for these episodes and just studying in general has changed your overall like ability to absorb information, retell stories, connect things like this. So I was going to ask you how much of smarts do you think is pure genetics? Like when you meet a kid who can like build Lego towers and they're only like age one, or our real good example is William Sidis, the kid that was born with 260 IQ, and he was reading New York Times at age 2. Like, how much do you think IQ is just pure genetics?
I think of a story. A friend of mine, he from church. He went over to his friend's house. He's a salesperson, and then he has two young sons. And then his friend is an engineer at Intel and has two young sons. And he said he's watching them play, and his sales sons were running, pulling on the curtains, jumping on the visitors in the lap. And then the engineers kids were almost didn't acknowledge that they had company over, and they were looking at the Legos and building a thing that, you know what I mean. Like,
Right.
they look like we're world's little mechanical engineers.
In my mind, for no reason, they have British accents. They're like, "Mama, Papa, we have guests today." Yeah.
Exactly. and and so Based on that, I think that these sales boys are going to socially do make their way in life, and these engineer kids are going to it's gonna come easier to them. So I'm gonna go DNA on this one.
Okay, I'm because of Sidus and because of how much we'd studied about intelligence and just from sort of like reading about people on the autism spectrum, I really thought almost all intelligence was DNA. Um, I only kind of got disabused of that notion when we started reading about classism and socioeconomics for like our Anna Delvey episode, and we've had episodes about how your environment can make you dumber. My best example of this actually comes from real life. I went to a political program when I was in high school called Boys State, which they take juniors and send them to a nearby college. So like you're in junior high school, and they're like, oh, we're gonna need you to go to college for a couple of weeks to learn how to be politicians. And it works. Like a lot of these kids end up going into politics and becoming like heads of state and running for minor offices. But while I was there, I met somebody who had the highest IQ of any kid there. He's like, what are you when you're a junior? Like 15 or 16 or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and he was like, he had the written test that proved he was a genius. Like he had Einstein's IQ. And he told us jokingly, he's like, I'd be smarter if I wasn't born poor. And we thought he was kidding, but then he was like, no, literal studies have shown that like um, growing up in stress and poverty, you have 13 points less IQ, and the reason why is because your brain permanently is dedicated toward figuring out where the
What's
next
to
danger is coming from,
yeah, what's
where
to
food is
eat?
coming from,
Yeah.
uh, uh, doing the math of like when you're in the store, is it 8 cents per ounce for these beans or is it 12 cents per ounce, and like trying to do the math on that. So
Well,
we're
we see that with the arts too. The
yeah.
people who are the actors and the singers and stuff, they can't worry about those. It's a tiny percentage of them that don't come from you know, very supportive families.
Yeah, I don't remember what episode we talked about that on, but yeah, that was something like a Smithsonian article about how it's like every point up in the tax bracket you come from, your family, you're that much more likely, like you're 1% more likely to become an artist or a creative in some way. Um, so yeah, no, there are absolutely environmental factors that will lower or raise your IQ depending on what happens. Um, and like the other example, we actually do have a DNA answer for what switches can be closed or opened to raise or lower IQ points.
I want to go back to that kid that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that his self awareness is going to serve him well. And we've learned that the William size was the smartest man. He had a high Q, 50 points higher than Einstein. Um, and he ended up having tough times in life, and we find a lot of them do. They on average, geniuses over just intelligent people earn about 10% more is all, and
Yeah.
their lives are plagued with. So it's kind of a bit of a curse to have too high an IQ. And I wonder if this kid, because he's got those street smarts and that high IQ, is going to just change the world.
Right.
Have you followed up with this? We should buy stock in this kid if he was a public company.
I won't drop his name, but he is now he is a professional writer now, and he writes for nonfiction. Like he writes the briefs for companies, and he writes technical manuals. So I assume that makes a lot of money. Like he does it. So
If he's happy, he's making a lot of money. Those are the things we can measure, right? The
yeah,
money part.
I will say he looks tired, but that might be because he has kids. But yeah, it was interesting to like be reading these studies and have like that like old information I got back in school validated. But um, yeah, part of if you want to know what raising IQ by behavior looks like, go to a Montessori school. Go to a school which is like one of these. If you're not familiar with Montessori schools, they basically have a teaching style where it's like more open. It's not based on a strict curriculum or benchmark testing. It's letting students pick their own subjects as long as it is worthy of them and worthy of making a goal out of. and being able to fail without consequence is a huge part of this. Um, and it produces higher performing students. Like the metrics bear out that it is worth doing, and they do test higher on IQ. I was shocked to find out that a lot of Montessori schools have higher IQ averages when they test than regular schools.
My,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
my mom has a tutoring business, and she works with kids who are dyslexic and have ADHD. And I've consulted for her. I've done some interviews with the parents with her, and I find this very fascinating. So what'll happen is the kids are struggling in school. They can't read sometimes, and so she'll say, "Let's test where you're at." And the parents are adamant that the kid is good at this and good at this and good at this, right? And my mom will say, "Well, let's try it out. Let's see where you're at." And when they just fail miserably, Joe, you should see the look on the parent's face. It's this utter shock. And what I chalk this up to, because I've done a lot of these, is in life, when we get set in our career and we get our 10,000 hours or whatever, and we're the manager supervisor at work, we're not tested very regularly.
Right.
But kids are. And when they are smart kids and they start going to honors classes, and my mom starts saying, "When did you start to fall behind?" And I think what I want to weave this back into this episode is Joe was elaborate to doing this show all the time. I don't know if it's made me smarter or if I've just got more information to talk about because I've had deadlines that I've had to study because I've had to perform on this show.
Okay.
Or is that the same thing? Is that intelligence when you have, more knowledge of things?
Well, that is a very good question. Is it may be that we have built ourselves accidentally a background of like we keep up with pop culture and science now and modern history, or is it have we actually changed our DNA by having a system where you and I study without consequences and we just do this as a regular practice?
It has to
Horvath,
I
yeah,
think
go
I
ahead.
think it's the latter. I think it does. I think if these parents had these tests at their work, would they be higher up in their organization or in their trade? I think absolutely. I think we
Right.
can all agree that continuous training is something that we value in physicians. We value in every profession, right?
Well, I completely agree, and this is backed up by the doctor that we're going to be referencing, Horvath, who did these the methylation studies, and he mentions in his curriculum of here are the 5 or 6 things you need to do to make your life extended, like that has been proven that can extend your life by a couple of years. Education is one of them. It's on his list. So I absolutely believe that. The DNA marker for this is DRD2, and it's a epigenetic switch. And when it is closed, IQ rates can fall. So, like, we do know there are literal DNA switches in your DNA that will respond and that can limit or extend the amount of dopamine you get for basically like thinking and studying. And when uh, um, effectively, if you don't get enough of the neurotransmitter dopamine, you can have a harder time studying, a harder time learning. It can literally affect your intelligence. Dopamine is going to be an important part in the next part too. We're going to talk about conscientiousness, and dopamine is the star there as well. So like, and that also has a direct tie to DNA methylation and what you can and can't change.